This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hello. In this clip, we're going to talk about the light that the Commonwealth Oral History Project interviews throw on the whole issue of the leadership of the Commonwealth as an organisation. The Commonwealth Secretariat is established in 1965, and the first Commonwealth Secretary-General is appointed then. And currently we're on to our sixth Secretary-General. So let's just go through and name them. The first Secretary-General was Arnold Smith. He was a Canadian, and he served from 1965 to 1975. His successor was Sir Sunny Ramphal, who was from Ghana, and Sunny Ramphal was the longest serving Secretary-General to date. He served from 1975 right up until 1990. The third was Chief Emeka Nnukwu from Nigeria, who served from 1990 to 2000. Then there was Don McKinnon, who's from New Zealand, who served from 2000 to 2008. The recent Commonwealth Secretary-General, Kamala Sharma from India, served from 2008 to 2016. And we've recently had the appointment of Patricia Scotland, Baroness Scotland, who has dual Dominican and UK nationality. You can see in that lineup that there is an attempt, at least, to have a geographical spread of Secretary-Generals, and there was a sense this time round that it was the Caribbean's turn. You can also trace, I think, at least three distinct phases. So, say from 65 to 75 under Arnold Smith, the real job was to set up the Secretariat and the role of Secretary-General, and to give it substance and to get it recognised. From 1975 to 1990, under Sunny Ramphal, the trick really was to get it to work effectively and to show that it was really a very useful instrument. From 1990, I suppose the challenge was to respond to change and to some real challenges. The Cold War was ending. It was a very different sort of geopolitical climate. And also the issue of South Africa was beginning to be resolved. And South Africa had been the kind of burning issue of the Commonwealth up until then. It's the thing that had sort of united most of its members in trying to push for majority rule in South Africa. And you could say that the Commonwealth has kind of struggled to find, if you like, a signature issue since then. In terms of the people, three of them were career diplomats, Smith, Nnukwu and Sharma, and three of them were politicians, Ramphal, McKinnon, and currently Baroness Scotland. I think probably the key finding, if you like, of the Commonwealth Oral History Project has been the importance of leadership. The Commonwealth Secretariat is a fairly small organisation, and so the personality of the Secretary-General is really important in deciding its character and how it works and how it approaches the question of disseminating and publicising its activities. And there's also a question there. Are diplomats better at being Secretary-General, more effective than politicians? A lot of what the Commonwealth is about quiet diplomacy. And that's very much been associated with the diplomats, Smith, Nnukwu, Sharma. The politicians, on the other hand, tended to have a rather higher profile, particularly Ramphal. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? So let's look at some particular issues. I think it's important to start off with by saying that when the Secretariat was created, there was quite a lot of resistance to the idea that it should really become, a proper organisation, international organisation, maybe along the lines of the United Nations. The British government certainly was afraid that if the role of Secretary-General was too effective, it might detract from British influence within the Commonwealth. And conversely, a number of other Commonwealth countries feared that it might impinge upon their sovereignty and their autonomy. So there was a real challenge for Arnold Smith as the first Commonwealth Secretary-General. Sir Peter Marshall, who was British Deputy Secretary-General of the organisation, has this to say about Arnold Smith. Marshall says, quote, "Arnold was more of a diplomat, an international civil servant, almost like a Kamala Sharma. Of course, Arnold Smith's problem was setting the Secretariat up and having these bloody-minded British officials to deal with. There were some of them who were extremely disobliging, and that's probably a British understatement." David Mcdowell, who was special assistant to Smith, makes a similar point and gives a little bit more detail. Here he's comparing the styles of Smith and his successor Ramphal. Mcdowell says, quote, "Each of them was, I think, appropriate to his time. Arnold had to kickstart the role of the Commonwealth Secretariat. The British had a very negative view of the role of the Secretariat, and people like New Zealand Prime Minister Robert Muldoon used to refer to Arnold and Sonny as the Commonwealth Secretary, and he did it deliberately. He was saying, your job is to write the minutes." That was a particularly offensive attitude and typical of Muldoon, but right at the beginning, Arnold's activism, his ability to persuade people, his straight-out courage and stubbornness was really pretty important. Adu would crack his knuckles and say, "Arnold, do you really think we should do this?" And Arnold would say, "Yes, I'm going to do it." And off he'd go, or we would go. It's quite interesting. Arnold Smith is sometimes seen as a slightly grey figure compared to his successor, Sonny Ramphal. And yet there was a really steely determination there to expand the remit of the Secretariat, to move it into new issues like development with the creation of the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation. If the term isn't inappropriate in this setting, Smith was a bit of an empire builder, if you like. And he wasn't afraid of impressing his own ideas upon the organisation. There's a lovely quotation, it's one of my favourites from the collection, by Tony Eggleton, who was Director of Information at the Commonwealth Secretariat under Smith. Eggleton says this: "Arnold taught me some useful lessons, i.e., don't call a meeting unless you can be fairly certain of its outcome, write the draft minutes before the meeting, and try and ensure the final communiqué is a fair reflection of the draft. I found these tactics of value in my later political career," unquote. Well, I'm sure many of us would probably say the same. Of course, the Secretary-General is bound by the collective will of the Commonwealth. The problem is that if you try and get everyone's agreement to everything, too many cooks will definitely spoil the broth, and there will always be someone telling you not to do something. So, as a kind of behind-the-scenes operator, Smith clearly helped to build solid foundations for the organisation. But Ramphal, his successor, did something slightly different. Ramphal was a far more outspoken, ebullient, charismatic figure who really gave the organisation a sort of public presence. He was a very well recognised public figure of his time in the 70s and 80s. Chief Emeka Anyukwu, who worked in the Secretariat under Ramphal and later became Secretary-General himself, said this, quote, "Well, I would say that Sonny Ramphal was a greater activist than Arnold Smith. Arnold Smith was a seasoned diplomat, and as such observed the constraints of diplomacy, both in his pronouncements and in his dealings with heads of government. Sonny, on the other hand, had been a very outspoken politician, seasoned in non-line movement diplomacy, and so brought to his office some non-line perspectives, which Arnold Smith was clearly not in a position to reflect." Gareth Evans makes a similar point about Ramphal. He says, quote, "With due respect to Emeka and Don McKinnon, I don't think any subsequent Secretary-General had the force of personality and the ability to really make the kind of difference that Ramphal did. Ramphal was a force of nature in many ways, and organisations of this kind very much depend on their leadership. There are all sorts of institutional constraints that limit the capacity of the most enthusiastic and competent leaders in the world, and you have to be very strong to overcome them. The Ramphal period was the heyday of the Commonwealth," unquote. And a lot of people, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, nostalgia, would say the same. Now, that's not to say that being a public figure, being a charismatic figure, having your own ideas, will necessarily make you popular all round. And Ramphal was often at odds with the British government in particular, and specifically over the issue of South Africa. And so you'll find quite different views of him amongst some of his political adversaries, if you like. Here's a quotation from Douglas Hurd, Lord Hurd, who was Foreign Secretary under Margaret Thatcher. He says, quote, "Ramphal was what I would call, in the nicest possible way, a loudmouth. He talked a lot. He blew his own trumpet anywhere he could. And in a way, I think that reduced the total of good that he did. But he was succeeded by people who were not loudmouths, and they were people who you could take aside and talk to with confidence and so on. And they would respect that. A lot depended on the identity of the Secretary-General." We're going to go back just briefly to this question. Do politicians make better Secretary-Generals than diplomats? What's the advantage of being a politician? I suppose, perhaps predictably, the politicians we interviewed tended to think that politicians were better at being Secretary-General. Here's Jim Bolger, who was Prime Minister of New Zealand in the 1990s. Bolger says, quote, "The question could be asked as to whether there are benefits in having someone with a political background as Secretary-General, since they're dealing with politicians. The answer, all things being equal, is probably yes, if you get the right person. But the wrong politician, of course, could be the worst choice." Unquote. Don McKinnon, who was Secretary-General and also a former New Zealand Foreign Secretary, a politician, not surprisingly agrees with Bolger's point. McKinnon says, quote, "To me, it's a political job, because as a senior politician you are treating the leaders as equals, and they see you as close to one of them. You've got to be their equal. I've noticed that those who come from the civil service will always defer to ministers, presidents and prime ministers," unquote. I suppose the implication of that is that in deferring to ministers, they won't be able to drive through a clear policy of their own. And it's not just that politicians as Secretary-Generals can talk to other political leaders, if you like, as equals. There's also this issue of publicity. I mean, politicians are used to operating in the spotlight of media attention. Diplomats usually aren't. And Mackinnon makes the point that being prominent in the media is important. He says, quote, "You know, there's an awful thing about publicity we should all acknowledge. You can't survive without it. As an international organisation, you have to create some television news items at least once every couple of weeks. It doesn't always matter what it is. If you're never in the news, most ordinary punters would think the Commonwealth was dead." And I suppose some of his critics would say that one of the problems that we've had under particularly Secretary-General Ramphal is that Ramphal has been rather uneasy in dealing with the press, and that perhaps as a result the Commonwealth hasn't had the kind of prominence it's deserved, and its achievements haven't been properly recognised. There's one other thing, and I suppose we're thinking here about potential lessons that the new Secretary-General, Patricia Scotland, could draw. And that's about the organisation itself, because Secretary-Generals are not just promoting the Commonwealth on the public stage, they are the chief executive, if you like, of an organisation with personnel issues, as all organisations have. Don Mackinnon is particularly associated with the idea that the Secretariat itself needed to be reformed and refreshed, that there were too many people who weren't doing a good enough job and had been there too long. And Mackinnon justifies this point in one of his interviews. He says, quote, "I tell you, 2 years after the changes started, you really felt it. People were walking faster, they were moving faster, they were doing things, they were trying things out. And I realised you bring in a new person to a job and they want to prove that they're pretty good. They will work harder, they will bring ideas, they will innovate, and they will do things like that, and it becomes a little infectious." The problem, of course, that Mackinnon faced was that inevitably there was a lot of resistance and a lot of discontent as a result of his attempts to clear out what he would see as ineffective members of staff. And that will inevitably, that kind of controversy will be associated with his legacy. And I suppose the new Commonwealth Secretary-General, Patricia Scotland, when she views the organisation and thinks about what she's going to do with it, we'll have to remember both the benefits of institutional change and the challenges that poses.